Aperture.
As Josh was saying, the books just came in, and it's kind of a wait for it kind of an event, as was this, which occurred a couple of weeks ago. The black hole. The black hole image that people, 2 weeks before it was released, people were saying, you're going to see a picture of a black hole in a couple of weeks. And then the week later, it was, you're going to see a picture of the black hole in a week. And then it was, you're going to see a picture of this black hole on Wednesday. And the picture came out, and it was a kind of extraordinary event because it was years in the making, which some science pictures are. The photograph shows a black hole 54 million miles away from Earth, and what you see, that orange ring, is energy that's coming from gas at the exterior of the black hole. And to make this image, it took 8 telescopes at 8 different observatories, about 15 days worth of collecting data, and then 2 years to crunch the data, which was all put together by a 29-year-old graduate student, a woman, who figured out the algorithms for it. And then it created this picture, which was something that nobody had ever seen and people thought they would never see before. And what's happening more and more, given the state of the world and the state of the universe, is that science is more visible in the news. So the week after the black hole picture comes out, this is the lead article in the New York Times based on a lot of United Nations reporting. And civilization is accelerating extinction. And in terms of dealing with climate change and putting the message out, imaging has become absolutely central to communicating to the public the urgency of issues that are going to impact them. So this is a quote by Stuart Brand, who some of you may know did the Whole Earth catalog in the 1960s that tried to catalog kind of all knowledge up to that point, and people think is a precursor to the web. But I thought it was kind of extraordinary what he said. Science is the only news. When you scan a news portal or magazine, all the human interest stuff is the same old he said, she said. The politics and economics, the same cyclical dramas. The fashion's a pathetic illustration of newness, an illusion of newness. Even the technology is predictable if you know the science behind it. Human nature doesn't change much. Science does. And as the change accrues, altering the world irreversibly, right? And I kind of read that, and this is a project I've been working on it for a couple of years, and have really come to this way of thinking more and more. But as I was kind of preparing for talking today and thinking about how I got around to being interested in science, I thought back to images that I saw when I was growing up. So when I'm a baby boomer, and we saw images like this all the time, these big, scary science images, right? Or these images that were about the good side of science. This is how science is going to change your life. This is DuPont in the 1950s that is promising better things and better living through chemistry. And, on the one hand, the babies are being protected from the rain. On the other hand, they look like they're for sale in a supermarket. And then there's like the suffocation factor. So it's kind of a weird idea, right? But science imaging started spreading out in post-war America, certainly, in all kinds of ways, on television, in shows like Mr. Wizard, in the release of polio vaccine in the mid-1950s, which was probably one of the first times there was such a huge vaccination program. It's Elvis Presley getting his shot, his polio shot. And then science starts infiltrating popular culture, which it always had. There's science fiction films that go back to the earliest of movies, but this is 2001, in 1968. And then the big transformative moment, or one of them in terms of science imaging, is this, this image that's known as Earthrise. And it was taken on the Apollo 8 mission when they were looking for landing sites on the moon. So this is the 4th site. They didn't land on the moon on Apollo 8, they just orbited the moon. And on the 4th orbit, everybody is looking out the windows at the surface of the moon, except for Bill Anders, right, who is looking out the other side of the capsule and sees this and grabs a camera and shoves a cassette of color film into it. And he says literally, oh, wow, look at that picture, right, when he sees it. I mean, he saw it and immediately knew it was a picture, and the film, when it went back to Earth, kind of transformed people's understanding of their place in the universe, which was, some people, credit this as being a pivotal image in the environmental movement. But there were lots of other ways that science images were infiltrating my life. In the 1970s, when I was working with a lot of artists and running a lot of galleries, Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel published Evidence, which was this extraordinary book in 1977, where they kind of went through a whole bunch of archives, science archives, corporate archives, and pulled out pictures that they thought were curious or weird and stripped them of context and put them out into the world. So all of these pictures that were made by scientists for very specific reasons started going out into the world in different ways. And then when I started doing books, one of the first projects I did was a book called Talking Pictures, where Carol Kizmarek and I did this project where we went and interviewed people about the photographs that changed their lives. And I wanted to talk to a scientist and an inventor, so I called up Art Fry, who worked for 3M, and he was one of the people who was responsible for Post-its. And so I asked him what picture changed his life, and he had a desk, his office desk had a bunch of pictures behind it. It was all family pictures except for this one, right? And I said, well, what's that? He said, that's the photograph of adhesive on paper that we took. It's a 500-time magnification, and this is the photograph that showed why Post-its work, and this is what made 3M produce Post-its. So I was kind of fascinated by that. And then over the years, I did a bunch of science projects. This was one called, or science-related project. This was a project called Paradise Now that was about genetic revolution and artists' response to it, which is the first time I saw this image, which is called Photo 51, which was taken by Rosalind Franklin, who was a genetic researcher in 1952. She was working with a graduate student, and unbeknownst to her, the photograph was shown to Doctors Watson and Crick, right, who came up with the double helix structure for DNA, which they had been working on, but it was seeing this photograph, right, and seeing that X in the middle and imagining it, kind of expanding it from this 2D flat image into its three-dimensional version in their heads that got them to understand what the structure of the double helix was. And she never got credit for this picture at all for years, and they went on to win all kinds of prizes based on her work that she was unrecognized for. And then years later, I did the Photography Changes Everything project that Josh was talking about earlier, and that was something I did for the Smithsonian, talking to people in 100 different disciplines to see how photography changed what they did. And at one of the first meetings at the Smithsonian, I was sitting around in the castle with a bunch of scientists, the head of Harvard Smithsonian Astrophysics, and a woman who was an information analyst for the CIA, whose job was to look at thermographic photographs of cars in parking lots like this, because the CIA was tracking drug dealers. And it was her job to look at these photographs to see when engines had been turned on and off, to try to figure out people's whereabouts. So all of that kind of leads you to Seeing Science, which was a project that grew out of Photography Changes Everything, because in Photography Changes Everything, I got to talk to neurologists, forensic experts, astrophysicists, biochemists, people in extraordinary disciplines, and realized that working with and talking to scientists was, for me, as much fun and as curious and interesting as working with artists. And so the project came together to try to investigate how photography and science work together. This is a photograph that was taken at the March for Science in 2017 that I thought was really incredible, right? Because the first use of the word scientist is in 1854 by a friend of Charles Darwin's. He's the first person to use that word. And it's only 5 years later that the word photography enters the discourse, when John Herschel, who came up with the words positive and negative, used the word photography, right? So science and photography have been influencing each other forever, right? This is a quote from a physicist named Lawrence Krauss. If history is any guide, every time we've built new eyes to observe the universe, our understanding of ourselves and our place in it has become forever altered. And so that became the impetus to do this project. And as I mentioned earlier, with things like Photography Changes Everything, or the Talking Pictures project I mentioned, I like to do these big projects and go talk to a lot of people, and trying to figure out the way to do that and kind of collate all the information. First was to do a website. The project, Seeing Science, is a project that I did for the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, which is one of the leading science research and teaching institutions in the country. And the project is funded both by the Center for Art, Design, and Visual Culture at UMBC, but also from the Vice President's Office for Research. So the funding came from the scientists, which was really interesting. And I worked with one graduate assistant for about 3 years pulling together content on this. So this is what the website looked like, and it had lots of silos for dropping in information. We followed science news stories, there were quotations, I reached out to dozens of artists to participate in this. We commissioned essays, and all of that was great, but it was a website, and as much as I like doing websites, I think people know that websites both have strengths, which can be the depth of information in them, but the problem is getting people to spend time with them. So based on having done Photography Changes Everything and having had a wonderful experience working with Denise Wolf, who Josh mentioned, I came to Aperture and said, hey, let's do this again. And Denise said, sure, but let's figure out a way to do the book, right? You can't do it like a website. We can't replicate the website. So let's figure it out. So we had to come up with some kind of narrative structure, for this. And we came up with what you're seeing, which is the table of contents that talks about photography plus science equals knowledge, and that's really about science photography as data, as it's collected by scientists and used by scientists. And the second category is photography plus science equals culture, and part of what I wanted to do with this project was talk about how photography is represented in visual culture. Most museums and most authors who do projects about science photography do the same project over and over and over again. They pick out these fabulous 19th century pictures, and if you're lucky, they reach out to contemporary artists and they say, hey, riff off of them, and that's it. But it seemed to me that the whole enterprise of science photography was way bigger, way more expansive than this. And so that's where these categories come up. And the third category is about imagination and speculating about it. So I'll walk you through some of the pieces that are in the project. One of the earliest photographers was Anna Atkins, who's credited as being the first female photographer, first woman photographer, and possibly the first person to do a photographic book, who in the 1850s put together these volumes of cyanotypes of ferns and algae in England. There was just an extraordinary show of these at the New York Public Library that was really fantastic. The books are gorgeous little things, but they're like encyclopedic. So she's one of the first science photographers. But there were also people like, I think this woman's name's Maria Thomas. Let me just check. Yes, Maria Mitchell. She's the first female astronomer in the United States. And in 1857, she packed up a bunch of glass plate negatives of stars that she took across the Atlantic for a meeting that she had with the Royal Astronomer in England. And that was an interesting thing to think about too, as scientists make pictures both for their work and to communicate with other scientists as well. So the pictures serve multiple functions. And there's very, kind of laboratory-like neutral kind of pictures, and then there are photographs like these. This is from a series of photographs that were made in France in the late 19th century, about from the 1860s to the 1880s, by a neurologist named Guillaume Duchenne, who was trying to figure out the physiognomy of emotion, right? And so what he would do was shock people, right? Trying to cure things like epilepsy and other diseases, but also trying to track emotions. Then he taught himself photography and then made photographs of his experiments. And then there are people who were trying to kind of collate information. This is a book from 1873 from James Naismith and James Carpenter, and it's a book about the moon. And what's great about this book is that given the technology of the time, they could get pictures of the moon that were okay, but they couldn't do close-ups, they couldn't zoom in on anything. So what they would do was basically take the photographic information they made and build models out of plaster, right? And then photograph those. So the book is this kind of compendium of truthful pictures and untruthful pictures, and it's pretty spectacular. the 19th century is a kind of amazing period for discovery and different uses of pictures. This is one of many photographs made by Alphonse Bertillon, he worked for the Paris Police Department in the 1860s, and he's the person who invented mugshots and invented the system to make mugshots, collect them, and then he got into the measurement business because he was convinced that the physiognomy of people could reveal their criminality, could reveal their characters. So he was both making mugshots and teaching people how to identify, for instance, Jews. In the late 1880s, Ernst Mach, who's studying physics, makes the first picture of a sonic wave. In 1895, Willem Röntgen takes an X-ray of his wife's hand. This is the first X-ray. It's from 1895. And the story is she looked at the picture and freaked out, right, and said, "I have seen my own death," right? And what's interesting about this was this picture and X-rays in general start getting out into the world and causing a ruckus. This is a period when people are making spirit pictures and ghost pictures and fairy pictures, and this completely freaked people out. But it set up an expectation in the public that they would keep seeing pictures from the sciences that would show them things about the world and about themselves that they never knew. This is a photograph made by Edward Steichen, who's during World War I, was a pioneer of aerial photography and kind of led the field as he would go on to lead the field in advertising photography and fashion photography and one thing after another. And this is a big jump ahead to the Hubble space mission, which started in 1990 and is still functioning today and creates some of the most spectacular images. So this is like big scale science photography. But this is little scale science photography, right? These are like swallowable cameras, right? Which were invented not so long after the Hubble. So these are used to make endoscopic videotapes and take pictures. So the scale of science operation is really, kind of interesting to me. This is kind of looking at where things are going now. This is just a suggestion of what data sets are in the sciences. All of facial recognition, all of object recognition is based on training computer networks to recognize objects. So this is just a hint of one of those. And this is also a hint of where some of the newest kind of research is going. This is femtophotography that's going on at MIT, where they've now made cameras that take photographs in a trillionth of a second. Right, 1/1,000,000,000 of a second. And what these cameras are doing is basically bouncing laser light off of objects and through algorithms creating images of them. So this gives you an idea of the kind of range of imaging, which to me, the more I studied it, the more spectacular and consequential it seemed to me. So I got fascinated by it, but I also got fascinated by how science is represented in the world, right? And so in 1919, there's a solar eclipse that scientists all around the globe are tracking. And if you look, this is the cover of the New York Times. It's 100 years ago, I think this week, this happened, right? So the little photograph in the bottom is a photograph of the eclipse. And what scientists were looking at, you can kind of see in the diagrams, is that they understood that light coming from stars behind the sun, right, were bending, right? Light was bending as it came around the sun. And it was from looking at these photographs and measuring these photographs, right, that they figured out that Einstein's theory of relativity was correct, right? So Einstein, who was famous enough, right, within his field, becomes a worldwide celebrity, right? So this is Einstein and his wife, right, with Charlie Chaplin at the opening of City Lights in Los Angeles. So part of what the book does is also look at how scientists are represented in the public, which is a kind of fascinating thing. So this is Marie Curie in 1921 coming to America and surrounded by the equivalent of paparazzi at that point. This is a rocket launch in 1950, where all of a sudden you start to see public attention, being drawn towards these kind of events at then Cape Canaveral. This is Jane Goodall, who in the 1960s was doing work with Tasmanian chimps, right? And the reporting on her was constantly talking about this is being a Beauty and the Beast kind of thing. People were constantly talking about what she looked like, and she understood that by playing off of these pictures and that kind of Beauty and the Beast thing, that she could in fact raise money to continue her work, which she did. But things just kept getting bigger and bigger. And so in Life magazine in 1965, they run this cover story by Leonard Nielsen that is based on a book that he did in the same year that tracks the birth of a baby from the embryo to birth, right? This is on the cover of the magazine. This is the fastest selling issue of Life magazine ever. And if you think about what this might have meant in 1965, you think about how these images are being used today in terms of, reproductive rights and women's health issues, and there's this whole other extraordinary story to tell. So the book tracks all of this cultural visibility of the sciences. But what we also wanted to do in the book was talk about how people look at images of sciences and what they communicate and what they don't. So I worked with a group called Reading the Pictures that is about visual literacy, and we brought together a group of about 8 people to have an online event where we looked at 10 photographs that were used to represent science in the media in terms of telling big stories. And part of that group was one of the people who's one of the heads of the Hubble Space Telescope mission. We had the picture editor of Nat Geo, National Geographic. We had the science editor of NPR. We had Corey Keller from SF-MoMA. We had Rebecca Edelman, who's at UMBC, who's a terrific scholar of visual culture. And we looked at one image after another and did an online event that you can go online and see videos of. But we looked at images like this, which was designed by the Hubble Space Mission. It's a redo of a 1995 picture that was in black and white. To show an event from 6,500 years ago that basically shows the creation of stars. And the guy from the Hubble Space Mission talked about how multiple images went into the making of these. This is made with X-ray imaging and with conventional imaging and with, just 4 or 5 different kind of cameras, colorizing images, all with the goal of educating the public and getting the public interested in the sciences, which it did to the extent that objects like this exist in the world, right? So, people, there's a seductive quality to all of this. But we also looked at the kind of generic images, how stock images are used to illustrate science articles. This is about genetic engineering and about implanting stem cell research. This image appears hundreds of times, illustrating multiple articles, all with somewhat related subject matter. And then there's these pictures like this, which is the introduction of Pepper the robot at an IBM meeting 2 years ago, which is supposed to take something that's really scary to a lot of people and kind of humanize it and make it kind of sweet. And in fact, since this picture was taken, Pepper the robot's been sold to the Smithsonian and to hospitals and to hotels where Pepper is a concierge, and so Pepper has kind of entered the world since that time. But we were fascinated too by issues around environmentalism. It's like, how faced with really big issues can you get the public to pay attention, right, and not be scared off or somehow to engage in it. So this was a photograph that interested me because it was used to talk about algae blooms in Florida that was ruining the tourist business, that was ruining the fishing business. And I was fascinated by it because it's so green, and green is so associated with, the healthy version of the environment. But it was a fascinating thing to talk about, as was this, which was a piece that was made for an article about Zika, which was freaking people out also. And this was an image that I was fascinated with because it deals with issues about privacy. There's like everything from patient privacy to how you represent people with certain kinds of conditions. And this seemed to be a way to kind of encourage people to look and feel something. What was fun's the wrong word. What was interesting about the dialogue that we were having about it was the picture editor from National Geographic said, if I hired a photographer to go shoot this story and that person came back with this picture, I'd fire them, right? which I thought was really curious because I was looking at this thinking, you see this, you imagine yourself holding this baby, it's just, there's something very immediate about it that I thought was extraordinary. And then there's things like this, right? This was the science fair at the White House in 2012 when Obama is looking at a kid, a 14-year-old, demonstrating a marshmallow cannon, and just shows his like complete oh wow enthusiasm, which is talking about politics and support of the sciences, which is clearly something that we're not having happen right now. So images like this have a certain kind of poignancy as to what role the sciences are playing in the government's worldview. And the book also looks at things like the representation of race. We track the use in the 19th century of a scientist named Agassiz, who was at Harvard, who had commissioned daguerreotypes of slaves to kind of prove his ideas about racial inferiority, and then fast forwarding to a more recent cover of Time magazine to kind of deal in a different kind of stereotyping. So, as I said, the book deals with culture in that kind of way. But a big focus of the book is artists and photography and the sciences. And so there are about 45 mini exhibitions, you could call them, that look at how different people have made science images. This is Berenice Abbott, who shot pictures for a cover of a science textbook. What's kind of great about this, she did this in 1960. Berenice Abbott was well past the work that she was known for, was looking around for jobs, could not get work anywhere, and people at MIT said, come help us visualize principles of the sciences. So this project basically saved her life, right, in terms of for her being able to make a living. And the sciences were something she had thought about for a really long time. This is something she wrote in 1939. She wrote a manifesto about this. We live in a world made by science, but there needs to be a friendly interpreter between science and the layman. I believe that photography can be the spokesman. The function of the artist is needed here as well. The artist through history has been the spokesman and conservator of human and spiritual energies and ideas. Today, science needs its voice. It needs the vivification of the visual image, the warm human quality of imagination added to its austere and stern disciplines. It needs to speak to the people in terms they will understand. They can understand photography preeminently. I thought this was kind of a startling thing for somebody to be saying, and I don't know if this was for a Guggenheim grant or what this was for, but it's an indication of how imaging kind of moved along in the science. It's around the same time that she's saying this, Harold Edgerton is working with strobe photography and trying to figure out how to make vivid images about science principles that also will communicate to the public. So these became very well-known pictures. He went on to work for all of the big magazines, consult for governments, worked with Jacques Cousteau, and had kind of an extraordinary career. More recently, one artist who I've been interested in is Trevor Paglen, who did this piece called Megalith in 2017, which was a photograph of 70,000 images of numbers that are used by banking ATM systems to recognize people's handwritings on checks, which I thought was like mind-blowingly kind of good, right? But also thinking how photography is represented in wider and popular culture. One project that we did as part of Seeing Science was to work with Oliver Wasso, who does a lot of work looking at thematic images in social media or in sites like Pinterest or just on the internet, and kind of seeing what the memes were like and what the stereotypes of seeing were like and stereotypes of photographic expression. So in the book, there's about a dozen pages of Oliver's work on this project that show, for instance, how are scientists themselves represented. This is like women eating salad and laughing. This is the science equivalent of it, right? It's like scientists looking at blue beakers. It's like, why blue, right? What's the deal with this, right? And so these are the benign, like good scientists, but there's also the bad scientists, right? So this is the mad scientist. This is, everything from Frankenstein to Jerry Lewis as the nutty professor. But Oliver was also looking at things like 1970s textbooks, like how do you introduce sciences to a younger generation? So this was an extraordinary part of the project. And I'll just run by some of the other things that are in this section. James Ball, who's a British artist who works under the name Docubite, has been documenting outdated computer equipment and doing the kind of equivalent of gorgeous studio glamour shots of this outdated material. This is a wall-size installation by Penelope Umbraco that was photographs of the full moon. I think this piece was made in 2015, and so she selected images from the 1.12 million pictures of the full moon that were on Flickr and a full moon, and did this wall-based piece that's pretty spectacular. This is from a project by a photographer named Todd Forsgren that I was fascinated by. Because it kind of looks a little bit like Muybridge pictures, but it's not, and it looks a little scary, but in fact it's not. These are from a series of photographs that he made working with ornithologists who capture birds in what are called mist nets, where birds are caught and then measured and banded for identification purposes. But it's kind of, it goes back to this, science neutrality, science scary thing that I was kind of interested in when we were doing the book. This is from a series of photographs that Victor Schrager did that I kind of love because it's a postcard of Charles Darwin, who was photographed very often and hated being photographed, but kept being photographed, right? Pinned up in the woods next to a postcard of Mr. Natural, and from back in the R. Crumb days of the 1960s. And I was interested, and I think Victor was interested too, in how nature is represented and how images of nature that we see change our experience of nature and in nature. And then there's people like Rauschenberg, who in 1969 was one of 7 artists who went to work for NASA to document Apollo launches. And this is a guy named Jay Gould who's been following around amateur rocket enthusiasts who meet every weekend to set off rockets. And the pictures are fantastically joyful, right, and kind of wonderful. This is by Tanya Marcusa, who did fantastic photographs of wax anatomical models that were made in the 17th century. They're Italian wax models that were used to teach anatomy. Which is interesting because in some sense, once photography started being used in medical education, it kind of put these objects out of business and these kind of model makers out of business. This is a piece by Steve Miller, who's been doing a long-term project called Health of the Planet, looking at the Amazon and how everything that is happening down there in terms of transforming the landscape is changing not only the Amazon, but the planet as well. These were photographs by Paul Shambroom from a series that he did called Security a couple of years ago that I was kind of fascinated by because you've got this high tech out in nature. And again, it's both this, photography is good, photography is bad. It kind of goes back, science is good, science is bad, and goes back to the atom bomb pictures versus the cellophane pictures years ago. Nancy Burson is featured in the book because of the extraordinary work that she's done over the years. This is from a project she did in the 1980s where she was working with MIT scientists to figure out how to artificially age images by morphing images. So this was a project she did where Etan Pates, who was kidnapped on the streets of New York in 1979, there's a photograph on the left of him at the age of 7, I think, right? I think that's what it was. Something like that. And then this is him aged to, I believe, the age of 13 later. So these were kind of an extraordinary art-science collaboration. This is a photograph by Suzanne Anker, who's done these kind of vanitas pieces based on Dutch paintings, looking at images that combine symbols of life and death. And then there's a project by a guy named Nick Bowers, who he did this in 2014, and he was interested in what scientists thought about the work they did. So he did a project called Scared Scientists, and he went and asked people in different fields, whether it was earth scientists or biologists or chemists and biologists, to think about the implications of their work for the future, and then he photographed them. So there's this, and there's this. So that gives you an idea of the range of material of the artist work that's represented in the book. And then one of the other things that I wanted to do was kind of track how art and science and imaging all went together. So starting with the first lens, which is from 1000 BC, and people think it was used to start fires, there's an extensive timeline in the book that looks at the interactions of imaging, image collection, and technology to kind of get us from that lens, which you see in the upper left-hand corner, to what will be the Webb telescope, which is on the far right corner. But it kind of tracks everything, CAT scans, PET scans, all along the way. So that gives you an idea of the scope of the book. And we started off with a picture of the black hole from 2 weeks ago, and this was a photograph that came out 2 days ago. That, again, it's another mind-blowing kind of Hubble-based image. This is a photograph of, it was made, it's a composite of 7,500 photographs, right? That were put together by scientists to show the depth of the galaxy. And this photograph shows 265,000 galaxies, right? So, I mean, I looked at that and that's really hard to imagine, right? This is one of those images where you just think like, what is this, right? How do you deal with this kind of data? How do you deal with this kind of information? How do you deal with these kind of concepts? When I was working on the project, I asked a friend of mine who used to work at Polaroid what it was like to work with Dr. Land when he was doing, because he was an imaging scientist, and when he was developing, all the Polaroid materials. And they said, because what I found when I was working on this project is I would walk out on the street and my mind would be like in a place like this, right? And I was thinking, this is so big, I don't know how people do this. So I was asking them, how did Dr. Land do this? And they said they basically had to take PVC piping and make a gate, right, to the door near his building so he wouldn't walk out in traffic and get killed, right? The guy was so lost in thought, right, by looking at and thinking about photography. So that's what I thought when I looked at this. And the last image is from a project done by Daniel Steer, who's a British artist who lives in Germany. And again, it's this whole idea of looking and of seeing science. So that's your quick tour through this. The book, as Josh said, it's full of information. There's over 300 pictures in it. There are, I would say, 65 or 70 texts. I wrote a long essay kind of tracking what science photography is and really trying to redefine it for the moment and expand on the ideas of it. And then we've got all of those dialogues that I mentioned, and we commissioned about 8 other texts. So it's meant to be a readable book and an enjoyable book. And so I hope you read it and enjoy it. Thanks for coming.